The ship left the port under a golden sunset, its decks alive with chatter, music, and the kind of laughter that only comes when people believe they are safe. Cameras flashed, glasses clinked, and strangers leaned against the rails together, gazing at the horizon as though the sea had promised them paradise. But paradise is a fragile illusion, and sometimes the ocean keeps its own plans hidden until it is too late. Once the last light of the harbor slipped into the distance, everything began to change. Emily, a schoolteacher traveling alone, had come aboard to escape her ordinary life. She smiled at other passengers, attended the shows, and made polite conversation, but when the ship slept, she wandered. Crew members noticed her habits, the way she paused at the railings, staring into the ink-black water for long minutes as though she were listening to something beneath the waves. One steward swore he heard her whisper, "Do you see them too?" though no one else stood beside her. In her journal, later recovered from her cabin, her handwriting shook as she confessed, "They knock at the walls. They stand near the bed. I can't stop hearing them." The fourth night of the voyage ended with her disappearance. At dawn, her cabin was locked from the inside, her luggage arranged neatly, her sandals resting by the bed. The journal was left open, the last words scrawled, "They're calling me from the water." Security footage revealed her walking alone down the corridor at 2:47 a.m., her steps slow, her head turning suddenly toward the lens, her face twisted into something unrecognizable, her mouth open in a scream no one heard. Then the lights flickered, the feed distorted, and in the blink of an eye she was gone mid-step, erased as though pulled from existence. That was when the knocking began. Passengers in nearby cabins heard it at night, sharp and deliberate, echoing through the walls like desperate fists beating to be freed. One woman awoke to sobbing in the ventilation shaft, a faint voice begging, "Don't let them take me again." Crew searched her room, but every sweep ended the same, a bed too neatly made, mirrors fogging as though someone invisible breathed upon them, sandals untouched yet damp as if carried from the sea. Fear spread like a fever. People whispered of curses, of ocean spirits, of a ship haunted long before they had stepped aboard. Some passengers refused to sleep in their cabins, huddling together in lounges with the lights kept burning. Others demanded answers the captain could not give. To maintain calm, he ordered a grand dinner, chandeliers glowing, musicians playing, servants carrying plates with forced smiles. Yet as the laughter struggled to fill the air, every soul in that glittering hall felt the weight of something unseen pressing closer. The lights cut out in the middle of dessert. Darkness swallowed the hall, and in that blind silence came the sound of dripping water, though the room was dry. Someone screamed, another voice shouted, and when the lights returned, dozens of passengers stared at the glass doors leading to the deck. Pressed against the pane was Emily. Her hair hung in dripping strands, her skin pale and blue, her eyes hollow sockets of black water. She dragged her hand down the glass, leaving wet streaks mouthing words no one could hear. By the time the doors opened, the deck was empty. Only a trail of footprints remained, stopping suddenly at the railing. The ship sailed on, but from that night forward, nothing was the same. Doors creaked open on their own. Bare footsteps echoed down silent corridors. Some passengers claimed to wake with damp sheets, the scent of seawater thick in the air. A woman swore she felt fingers grip her ankle in the dark, pulling her toward the floor until she screamed. The crew grew pale and tired. Their patrols hurried, their eyes avoiding the cursed cabin. An elderly traveler whispered that the sea had chosen her, that once a soul was claimed, the ship itself became part of the hunger. He said it had happened before, and it would happen again. When the voyage ended and the survivors disembarked, they left with pale faces and hurried steps, grateful only to touch land again. Yet investigators who reviewed the booking records discovered something chilling. The same cabin had been reserved years before by another lone traveler who had also vanished at sea. 2 women, 2 disappearances. One cursed room bound to the waves, and still, long after, guests who stayed in that same room wrote of knocks in the night, of shadows pacing near their beds, of a drowned woman pressing her face against the glass, calling them closer to the sea. The ocean forgets nothing, and it always returns for more. The story of Emily haunted everyone who heard it, but it was not the only nightmare whispered about cruises. Another tale circulated among crew members, one they rarely admitted to passengers. They called it the cursed cabin, a place no amount of cleaning or redecorating could erase. Its wallpaper had been replaced, its carpets torn out, its furniture renewed, but still the screams returned, Guests unlucky enough to stay there spoke of icy drafts that carried the smell of rot, of mirrors fogging though the room was cold, of doors that locked themselves. Some woke to see a figure at the foot of their bed, watching with eyes too hollow to belong to the living. A newlywed couple once burst into the reception at 3 a.m, pale and shaking, insisting that a man dripping wet had stood in their room whispering, "It's not over." The staff moved them instantly, never assigning that room again, until management, desperate to hide the story, changed the cabin number. But numbers mean nothing to the dead. Those who took the room under its new disguise reported the same terrors. A family from London found scratches on the walls that hadn't been there hours earlier. A woman traveling alone described waking to hands gripping her shoulders though no one was there. And one night a child went missing from that cabin, found hours later sitting on the upper deck in the freezing wind, repeating, "She told me to come outside." When asked who she was, the child pointed to the sea and said, "The woman under the water." The ocean has many mouths, but it chooses its vessels carefully. Some ships carry memories darker than storms, and passengers sense it without knowing why. Smiles falter, dreams grow restless, and the sea itself seems to lean closer. The corridors of the ship began to feel longer, narrower, as though the steel itself was bending inward. What once felt like a floating palace of glass and light now resembled a labyrinth of cold metal, whispering with the sound of unseen footsteps. Crew members walked faster, avoided eye contact, and rarely lingered alone. One steward confessed, trembling, that when he polished the mirrors at night, reflections remained after he moved away. Faces that weren't his own, faces that seemed wet and swollen, staring back until he fled the hall. Passengers tried to keep up their routines, buffets, poolside drinks, live shows, but every laugh felt forced, every cheer hollow. Parents kept their children close, refusing to let them roam the decks. Even the performers noticed it. During one cabaret show, the power failed for less than 10 seconds, yet the violinist swore he saw a crowd of dripping silhouettes standing in the back row, vanishing as soon as the lights returned. He never played again that voyage, claiming his bow hand wouldn't stop shaking. On the 7th night, the sea turned violent. Waves struck the hull like fists, and the ship rolled under a sky without stars. Passengers clutched the rails, praying. But what unsettled them most was not the storm. It was the sound. Beneath the roar of water, another rhythm pulsed like dozens of fists pounding from inside the walls. The knocking came in unison with the lightning, echoing through the entire vessel. A woman fainted on the stairwell, screaming that the walls were breathing. The captain locked himself in the bridge, refusing to answer questions. Officers moved with clipped urgency, whispering orders too quiet for passengers to hear. But one engineer broke. He told a family huddled in the lounge that this wasn't the first time. That years ago, on another crossing, crew had heard the same knocking just before a passenger was found dead in a locked room, her lungs full of salt water, though she had never left the ship. The engineer's voice cracked as he added, "We painted over the stains, but the ocean doesn't forgive." That night, another passenger went missing. His name was Daniel, a writer traveling to escape deadlines. He had been seen in the bar, notebook open, scribbling frantically about shadows, about the way the sea watched with intent. At 1:12 a.m., CCTV caught him pacing the outer deck, muttering to himself. Suddenly he stopped, turned toward the black waves, and tilted his head as though listening to someone call his name. He set his notebook on the chair, stepped onto the railing, and leaned forward. The camera glitched. When the image returned, Daniel was gone. Only the notebook remained, its pages soaked and smeared. The captain announced it as an accident, but no one believed it. Fear spread faster than the storm itself. Groups formed. Passengers slept in clusters in the lounges, terrified to be left alone. Yet even in company, terror struck. A man awoke to find every passenger around him gone, the lounge suddenly empty, until a blink later they reappeared, asleep in their seats as though nothing had happened. He never spoke again, his hair gone white overnight. By the 9th night, whispers told of figures moving below deck, places no passenger should be. Crew swore they saw shadows slipping into locked maintenance rooms. The smell of seawater followed them. When a security officer descended to investigate, the elevator returned dripping wet, but empty. Passengers begged to turn back, but the captain's voice over the intercom was calm, rehearsed, robotic. "Everything is under control." Yet his hand shook and crew whispered that he had begun talking to someone no one else could see. One stormy midnight, the ballroom filled with screams. The crystal chandelier above the guests began to sway violently. Every glass shattered at once. The floor grew slick, though no water had spilled. Then, in the reflection of the shattered glass, dozens of passengers saw her again. Emily, standing in the crowd, her mouth open in an endless scream, eyes hollow and pouring streams of seawater. Hands reached from the floor, pale and writhing, grabbing ankles, pulling people down. For 3 minutes, chaos consumed the room. When it ended, 2 passengers were gone, their names erased from the official log as though they had never boarded. The ship sailed on. Those who survived later swore that the voyage felt endless, that days stretched unnaturally, time itself bending in the grip of the ocean. Clocks lost hours, meals were served at strange intervals, and windows sometimes revealed not the horizon, but endless black waves rising higher than the deck. One man claimed he saw the same hour repeat twice in a row, passengers repeating their movements like puppets. And all the while, the knocking never stopped. The sound followed them into dreams, into their waking hours, into every hollow corridor. Some said it came from the drowned. Others said it was the ship itself, alive and hungry, striking its own walls like a predator teasing the cage of its prey. When they finally reached port, the survivors disembarked quickly, refusing interviews, refusing photographs. Yet the most chilling discovery came later. Dock workers swore the ship arrived lighter than it left. Its manifest listed 3,100 passengers, but only 2,984 walked off. The captain refused to explain. The logbooks were missing pages, and the ship set sail again weeks later, ready to carry new souls into the deep. Because once you leave port, everything changes, and the sea never gives back what it takes. The sea had quieted, but the silence was worse than the storm. It pressed against the ears of every soul aboard, a suffocating stillness broken only by the groan of the ship's steel frame as though it strained under a weight no one could see. The passengers who had once filled the decks with chatter now moved in whispers, avoiding mirrors, avoiding shadows, avoiding each other's eyes. Even laughter from the children was gone. They slept too much, and when they did wake, they spoke of voices under their beds, of cold hands stroking their hair while their parents swore no one was there. Rumors spread faster than the tide. Some claimed the ship was following a route that didn't exist on any map, that the horizon never seemed closer no matter how many days passed. Others noticed the stars above were wrong, constellations bent or missing entirely, as if the ship had drifted into waters where the sky itself had been rewritten. Crew members broke ranks. One was found weeping in the storage hold, clutching a soaked uniform not his own, insisting it belonged to his brother who had died at sea decades earlier. Another ran screaming across the upper deck before throwing himself overboard in front of horrified witnesses, his last words echoing, "They're already here." No rescue attempt was made because no splash followed. He simply vanished into the air, leaving nothing but a damp outline on the railing. Passengers tried to demand answers, cornering officers, but the crew gave hollow reassurances, their faces pale, their eyes hollow with sleeplessness. A rumor began to spread among the guests that the captain had locked himself away completely, refusing food, refusing light, whispering in the dark to someone who was not there. Some swore they heard him speaking over the intercom in the middle of the night, though no announcement had been made. Broken words, fragments of prayers, begging the ocean for forgiveness. Then came the night of the black fog. It rolled across the sea without warning, swallowing the ship whole. Visibility shrank to nothing. Even the deck lights seemed to drown in the thickness of it. The air smelled of rot, of rust, of something ancient and alive. People gathered in the lounges, trembling, clutching each other as if touch alone could keep them tethered to reality. Outside shapes moved in the mist, long, shifting silhouettes that stretched unnaturally tall, taller than the ship itself. Passengers swore they saw faces within the fog, mouths gaping, eyes weeping seawater, pressing close to the glass only to dissolve when looked at directly. And then came the voices. At first, faint like loved ones calling across a distance. Mothers heard their dead children. Lovers heard partners buried long ago. Sailors heard the cries of comrades lost at sea. The sound coiled around their minds, pulling them toward the decks, toward the rails, toward the water. Security fought to restrain them, but some slipped free, walking straight into the mist as though hypnotized. No splashes, no screams, just gone. And when the fog thinned by morning, 22 passengers were missing. The ship's registry still listed their names. Their cabins were still assigned. But their belongings were gone, their beds neatly made, their photographs vanished from family wallets as though they had never existed. Even their families on board claimed their memories felt wrong, like trying to recall a dream that slips away the harder you chase it. By now, the survivors no longer called it a cruise. They called it a curse. One woman, pale and trembling, claimed the ship itself was alive, that its corridors shifted when no one looked, leading people astray. She said she saw the walls pulsing as if they breathed, the floor rippling under her steps like wet skin. No one believed her, until a group of teenagers exploring the lower decks stumbled back screaming, claiming they had walked for hours in circles only to end up in the same hallway, except every door they passed was sealed shut and dripping with salt water. That night, the ballroom filled again, though no one had gathered willingly. The ship itself seemed to summon them. Doors unlocked, elevators descended, lights flickered until the passengers were herded into the glittering hall. The chandeliers swayed though the sea was calm. Then the floor began to flood. Thin streams of water seeped between the tiles, rising ankle-deep in minutes. People panicked, clawing at the doors, but they were sealed. And in the rising tide, faces appeared. Pressed just beneath the surface of the water, dozens of pale visages stared upward, mouths open in silent screams, eyes wide with agony. The passengers tried to climb onto chairs, onto tables, but the water rose higher, up to their waists, to their chests. And when it reached the chandeliers, the lights died. Darkness swallowed everything. When the illumination returned, the water was gone, the floor dry as bone. But 7 passengers were missing. The ship sailed on. The survivors began to lose their grip on time. Days no longer unfolded with rhythm. Mornings bled into nights, nights into endless gray dawns, until no one could remember how long they had been at sea. Meals arrived at odd hours, clocks ticked backward, and sometimes passengers swore they relived the same conversations twice. A man dropped his glass in the lounge, shattering it. An hour later, he dropped the same glass again, shattering it in the exact same pattern, the same scream echoing through the same hall. The crew no longer hid their fear. Some abandoned uniforms entirely, wandering the ship barefoot, muttering prayers in languages passengers didn't understand. Others locked themselves in storage rooms, scratching symbols into the walls, marks that looked more like warnings than words. A young steward was found in the laundry, his fingernails torn bloody from carving "Don't look at the water" into the steel drum of a washing machine. He died before anyone could ask what he meant, lungs filled not with air but brine. Passengers began to hear footsteps outside their cabins at night. Heavy, dragging, wet. Some claimed to see water seeping from beneath their doors, pooling on the carpet even though the hallway beyond was dry. One family opened their door to find the corridor stretched endlessly in both directions, lined with unfamiliar cabins whose numbers made no sense. They shut it immediately and huddled together, refusing to open it again. Even when someone knocked softly hours later, knocks that perfectly mimicked their missing daughter's voice begging to be let inside. The ship's entertainment shut down. The pools drained themselves in the middle of the night, leaving slick, salt-stained tiles. Elevators refused to stop at certain floors, their panels flickering with symbols instead of numbers. The gift shop windows fogged over from the inside, though no one had been there in days. And all the while the ocean stretched in every direction, black and endless. No sign of land, no sign of rescue, as though they had slipped into waters no map dared mark. The captain finally spoke again. His voice trembled over the intercom. "We were never meant to cross these waters. They do not want us here. They never wanted us here." Then silence, followed by static so loud and piercing it shattered 2 speakers in the lounge. No further announcements came. On the 12th night, the ship itself began to groan. Passengers rushed to the decks fearing a collision, but the horizon showed nothing. The sound was not external. It was internal, as though the vessel's bones were shifting, bending, stretching. Doors no longer opened where they once did. Cabins swapped positions. The grand staircase descended into a corridor that had never existed before, lined with dripping walls and the stench of rot. One group that ventured down never returned, though faint screams sometimes echoed from that direction long after. And then came the singing. Soft at first, drifting through the vents, rising and falling like waves. A lullaby sung in dozens of voices, male and female, young and old. Passengers pressed their ears to the walls and swore they recognized the voices. Loved ones lost at sea, friends long dead, even their own, echoing back in perfect mimicry. The song grew louder each night until it was impossible to sleep, until people wept openly, begging it to stop. Yet whenever anyone begged too loudly, the song would change into laughter. One woman tried to end it all, hurling herself from the top deck into the black water. But instead of vanishing into the sea, she struck the surface as though it were solid, shattering every bone in her body. Her corpse floated face up beside the ship for 3 days, eyes wide open, staring upward even as the vessel pressed on. By the 4th day, her body was gone. In her place, a child was found sitting on the deck in her same torn dress, humming the same lullaby. No one knew who the child was. Passengers stopped asking questions. They stopped hoping for rescue. They moved like shadows, like husks, clinging to survival without understanding why. Because the truth was clear to anyone who still dared to think. This was no longer a cruise. This was a voyage into something else, something ancient, something hungry. And the ocean wasn't finished yet. The 13th night arrived without a sunset. The sky dimmed, then froze in a bruised twilight that never yielded to darkness, never broke into dawn. Passengers stared upward in despair, realizing the heavens themselves had abandoned them. Some wept, some prayed, some simply stared blankly at the unmoving horizon as if hypnotized. It was then the ship began to show its true self. Rust bled through the pristine white paint, streaking the hull like dried veins. Carpets peeled back, revealing warped planks slick with seawater. Wallpaper in the cabins curled away to uncover markings etched deep into the steel. Symbols older than language, shapes that seemed to twist if you looked at them too long. Some passengers swore they had seen the ship's name change on the stern. Letters writhing, rearranging into something unreadable, a word that burned in the eyes but refused to lodge in memory. One brave group descended to the engine room, desperate to confront the captain or find a way to turn the ship back. They never reached their destination. Halfway down, the corridors shifted. Lights flickered and walls seemed to breathe, inhaling and exhaling in slow, wet rhythms. The group's screams echoed for hours. Yet when rescue parties searched, they found only puddles of brine and scraps of clothing. Days later, passengers reported hearing those same voices in the ventilation, begging to be released. The captain finally appeared again. He stood in the grand hall before a crowd of pale, hollow-eyed survivors, his uniform disheveled, his face sunken. He raised his hand for silence and delivered a speech no one ever forgot. "This vessel is not ours," he said. "It never was. It is a ferryman and we are its cargo. The ocean chose us the moment we left port. We are not sailing to a destination. We are being carried to a debt owed long before we were born." His words were followed by chaos. Passengers shouted, demanded answers, demanded release. But the captain only smiled faintly, eyes glistening with tears, and whispered, "Listen closely. You can hear them knocking." And at that moment the sound returned. Not a storm, not a groan of steel, knocking. Loud, deliberate, rhythmic. It echoed through every wall, every floor, every pipe, shaking glasses, rattling teeth. Knock after knock, like 1,000 fists pounding from the other side. The chandeliers swayed as though in a gale, though the air was still. People clamped hands over their ears, sobbing, but the sound grew louder until it seemed the ship itself would tear apart. Then, silence. Every light went out. The hall plunged into blackness. When illumination returned, the captain was gone, only his hat remained, floating on a puddle of seawater at the center of the room. From that night forward, the ship no longer pretended. Corridors twisted openly into places that shouldn't exist. Stairwells that spiraled into endless darkness. Cabins that opened onto vast oceans instead of beds. Bathrooms with mirrors that showed other passengers trapped inside, pounding on the glass. The ship had shed its disguise of luxury and revealed its truest form, a labyrinth of hunger, forged from steel and sorrow. And one by one, the passengers were swallowed. Some vanished quietly, their cabins found empty, beds neatly made. Others were taken violently, dragged screaming into the walls, clawing gouges into the metal as they disappeared. A mother clutched her child only to feel him dissolve in her arms into a spray of seawater, his laughter echoing faintly in the vents hours later. Couples awoke to find their partners replaced with dripping doubles, eyes too wide, smiles too sharp, whispering and voices just a little too distorted. The ocean had breached the ship. Not through waves or storms, but through something far older. Those who survived long enough to realize the truth dared not speak it aloud. The ship was not a vessel. It was a mouth, and the sea was feeding. The days that followed blurred into something unnatural, as though the ship had slipped beyond time itself. The clocks no longer mattered. Some ticked forward in frantic bursts, others slowed until their hands barely moved. The sun never rose, the moon never appeared. Only that endless twilight sky pressing down, heavy and suffocating. Passengers wandered the decks like ghosts, hollow-eyed, whispering to themselves, some refusing to speak at all. Whole families sat motionless in the lounges, hands clasped, gazes fixed on the horizon where nothing ever changed. Others disappeared in plain sight. A husband stepped into the bathroom and never returned. His wife pounding the locked door until it swung open to reveal nothing but seawater flooding the tiles, before draining into the cracks. The children were the first to stop resisting. They no longer cried, no longer clung to their parents. They simply stared at the water with strange serenity, humming the lullaby that had once echoed through the vents. At night, they wandered barefoot through the corridors, dripping wet, leaving trails behind them though no one saw them leave their cabins. When parents tried to restrain them, the children whispered, "It's okay, the ship chose us." By the 16th night, survivors stopped counting. They stopped asking when the voyage would end. The truth had rooted deep into them. This was not a cruise. This was passage. It was in the theater that the worst came. Without warning, every light aboard snapped on at once. The ship groaned, shuddering so violently passengers fell to the ground. Doors slammed open and everyone was herded by unseen force, by instinct, by something beyond comprehension, into the theater. The curtains parted on their own. The stage was bare except for a single chair. Seated in it was the captain. His skin was pale, his eyes black pits dripping streams of brine. His lips moved, but the sound came from the walls, the floor, the ceiling all at once. "You are the offering," he said. "The sea does not forget. The sea does not forgive. And the sea always collects." The screen behind him flickered to life. Passengers screamed as they saw themselves projected, footage of their own lives, their happiest moments, weddings, birthdays, births of children, intercut with visions of themselves drowned, bloated, floating lifeless in the black water. The images grew faster, overlapping until they blurred into a single monstrous shape. The ship itself, its silhouette rising from the depths, its windows glowing like eyes, its decks like jagged teeth. The theater doors sealed shut. The floor began to flood. Panic erupted. People clawed at the walls, tore at each other in desperation, trampled children underfoot. The water rose faster than natural, filling the theater to the balcony within minutes. Faces pressed against the glass of the upper windows, those same drowned figures watching eagerly. When the water reached the ceiling, the last thing anyone saw was the captain, smiling as the sea poured from his mouth. And then, darkness. When the lights returned, the theater was empty. Not a single passenger remained. The ship drifted on. Weeks later, when it arrived at port, it appeared immaculate once more. Gleaming white paint, polished brass, no sign of decay, no sign of horror, but the manifest listed no passengers. The crew smiled too widely as they welcomed the next eager crowd aboard, as though nothing had ever happened. And far below, deep in its belly, the ship groaned softly, like a predator digesting its meal. Because once you leave port, everything changes, and the ocean never lets go. The ship's return to port should have been salvation, yet it was the cruelest trick of all. Families and friends waited at the docks with flowers and banners, expecting to greet loved ones after a long voyage. But when the gangway lowered, only the crew stepped off, smiling, waving, their uniforms crisp and gleaming. Not a single passenger appeared behind them. Dock workers whispered that the crew seemed too calm, too rehearsed, their eyes glassy like mannequins. When questioned about the missing thousands, the captain simply said, "They disembarked elsewhere." Customs officials searched the vessel, but every cabin was spotless, every bed made, every suitcase gone. No photographs, no scraps of clothing, not a trace of anyone who had supposedly boarded. Even digital records had been altered. The booking systems showed empty manifests as though the voyage had never carried passengers at all. Families protested, but the authorities shrugged. treating it as clerical error, miscommunication, anything but the unthinkable truth. That night, dock workers heard the knocking. It echoed from deep inside the hull, loud enough to rattle chains and make gulls scatter into the night. Some swore it came in patterns like fists pounding desperately from within sealed cabins. One worker, shaken, pressed his ear to the steel and claimed he heard voices, hundreds of them whispering in unison. "We're still here." The ship sailed again the next morning, loaded with a new crowd of tourists eager for luxury and adventure. Advertisements promised romance, fine dining, unforgettable memories. No one mentioned the missing. No one admitted what had happened. The ocean swallowed the truth just as it had swallowed the passengers, but the survivors did exist, though not in the way the world expected. Across continents, strange phenomena began. Families of the missing reported wet footprints trailing through their homes at night. Telephones rang with the voices of lost loved ones, speaking from impossible distances, begging to be rescued. One woman swore she woke to find her husband, who had vanished on the cruise, standing at the foot of her bed, dripping seawater, his mouth opening wider and wider until it split his face. When she screamed, he dissolved into a puddle that soaked through the floorboards. Others received postcards in the mail, stamped with the ship's insignia, dated weeks after its return. The handwriting was familiar, but the messages were chilling. "Don't board. Don't sail. The ship is not a ship." Meanwhile, the vessel itself grew infamous among sailors. Fishing crews swore that on certain nights, far from any port, they glimpsed it drifting silently across the horizon. Sometimes its lights glowed brightly, music and laughter drifting over the waves as though the passengers still partied inside. Other times it appeared as a dark silhouette, rusted and broken, windows flickering with pale faces pressed against the glass. Always it vanished before anyone could approach. The sea had claimed its ship, and the ship had claimed its role. Some whispered it was the ghost of every vessel lost at sea, bound together into one endless voyage. Others insisted it was a mouthpiece for the ocean itself, luring humans with promises of escape only to feed on their fear and flesh. A few believed it was punishment, a floating purgatory for the sins of those who thought they could tame the deep. But one truth remained unshakable. Once you left port aboard that cursed liner, you were no longer a traveler. You were an offering, and the ocean never gives back what it takes. Long before glossy brochures and five-star cruises, that vessel had another name, another purpose. In the archives of a crumbling naval yard, hidden beneath mildew-stained ledgers, a record surfaced. The hull had been laid down during wartime, intended not for leisure but for transport of prisoners and cargo no one dared catalog. Workers whispered of sealed compartments welded shut before the keel even touched water. Compartments that reeked of formaldehyde and rust, though nothing was stored inside. Shipwrights noticed strange defects, rivets that popped loose, bulkheads that groaned like a living creature. Tools disappeared, then reappeared twisted into shapes no human hand could bend. One welder swore he saw a face pressing outward from inside a steel plate, eyes wide, mouth screaming, before the surface smoothed over again. When he refused to return to work, he was found floating in the dock, lungs filled not with salt water but with oil. Still, the war demanded ships, and so it was completed, launched under a false name, and sent into the world carrying secrets locked within its bones. Its first voyage ended with disaster. A convoy escort discovered the vessel drifting, crew gone mad, scratching at their own skin until it peeled. No survivors were recorded, yet months later the same ship reappeared at a different port, freshly painted, crewed by strangers who swore they had served aboard for years without incident. Authorities looked the other way. Paperwork was altered. The truth drowned in bureaucracy. Over decades it changed owners, changed names, always returning after tragedy. Fires broke out mid-ocean, yet passengers emerged unharmed, confused, claiming the blaze had never happened. Hull breaches sealed themselves. Logs showed weeks lost, with the ship docking days late, but everyone aboard believing the schedule was exact. Families noticed differences in their loved ones. Subtle shifts in voice, manner, the way they held a fork or laughed at a joke. Were they the same people who boarded, or copies molded by something hidden in the steel? When cruise companies bought the vessel and marketed it as a luxury liner, they unknowingly offered it exactly what it craved: souls in abundance, eager to surrender themselves for adventure. From the moment the first band struck up a tune in the dining hall, from the first champagne bottle smashed against the prow, the cycle deepened. Each departure was a feeding, each arrival a performance to reassure the world nothing was wrong, and yet the ocean remembered. Fishermen who tracked its path on sonar noticed distortions beneath, vast shadows that matched neither whale nor submarine, shapes circling like guardians or jailers. Some said the ship was not sailing upon the sea at all, but being carried, escorted, dragged across the surface by something far older than mankind. Legends crept through port towns. Don't whistle near the docks when it's in port. Don't look too long at its portholes. Never accept a ticket offered at a discount. Dockside bars carried stories of men who dreamed of drowning every night after simply touching its hull. Women who heard lullabies in forgotten languages humming from its chimneys. The ship was no mere vessel. It was a ritual given form, a cathedral of steel consecrated not to gods of mercy but to the hunger of the deep. And it waited. Every boarding party was just another congregation. Every champagne toast another prayer, and every scream, every terrified heartbeat, another offering sliding into the dark ledger of the sea. The voyage that cemented the ship's reputation began on a summer morning, the kind where the horizon shimmered like glass and tourists gathered at the dock clutching passports, cameras, and the kind of hope only vacations inspire. Children waved plastic flags, couples kissed as the boarding call echoed, and the ship loomed behind it all, immense, gleaming, almost too perfect. No one noticed how its windows seemed to blink like eyes, or how the hull's paint glistened as if wet with something thicker than seawater. Boarding was swift, almost unnervingly so. Crew members guided passengers with smiles that never reached their eyes. The band played, the champagne cracked, and the ship slid free of the pier with a groan like some beast exhaling. Families lined the railings, waving goodbye to the shrinking shore. Somewhere deep below decks, an empty chamber pulsed with a heartbeat no engineer had ever designed. The first day was idyllic. Pools sparkled, buffets overflowed, and laughter rose above the surf. Photos captured endless sunsets, glittering ballrooms, the clink of wine glasses. If unease lingered, it was only in fleeting moments. A waiter staring too long before blinking, a cabin door that refused to stay locked, a strange taste in the drinking water. Small things dismissed as quirks of travel, but by the third night things began to unravel. A teenage girl vanished from the cinema. Her seat was empty when the lights came up, her half-eaten popcorn still warm. Staff assured her parents she had simply gone to the arcade, but when the family searched, no one had seen her. Security footage showed her walking into the theater, and then nothing. She never left. Her parents demanded answers, but crew shrugged with polite sympathy. "It happens," one whispered. "The ship takes what it wants." By dawn, whispers spread. A newlywed missing from his honeymoon suite. An elderly couple gone from the breakfast table, their plates untouched. Announcements insisted all was well, urging passengers to enjoy their holiday. But corridors seemed longer than before, twisting into unfamiliar turns. Cabin numbers repeated themselves. Some doors opened to rooms that should not exist. Bunkers lined with rusted shackles. Ballrooms filled with mannequins dressed in passengers' clothing. A nursery where toys rocked themselves. The air thickened, damp and metallic. The sea outside grew unnaturally still, reflecting the ship's lights in a glassy black mirror. Stars above vanished, swallowed by a fog that crept over the decks like fingers closing a fist. Radios hissed with voices calling for help in languages long dead. On the sixth night, panic broke. Families clutched one another, pounding on locked doors as alarms blared without reason. Crew herded the terrified into the main dining hall, assuring them it was for safety. But once inside, passengers realized the exits were sealed. The chandeliers flickered, casting shadows that moved on their own, and the air filled with a chorus of whispers. Thousands of voices overlapping, murmuring promises, confessions, screams. Then the lights died. Some swore they felt hands brushing their skin in the dark. Others claimed the ship itself inhaled, sucking the air from the room. When the lights returned, half the passengers were gone. Tables stood empty, chairs toppled, glasses spilled. Those who remained found themselves staring at one another in horror, realizing they were next. The captain's voice boomed through the intercom, calm, almost joyful. "We thank you for your offerings. Enjoy the rest of your voyage." When the vessel finally limped back to port weeks later, it docked in silence. A skeleton crew disembarked, grinning with blank eyes. Every passenger's name had been erased from the manifest. Families screamed on the pier, but officials dismissed it as hysteria. Inside the ship, cabin after cabin gleamed spotless, as though no one had ever been there at all, and yet, in photographs taken during the Welcome Home celebration, faint figures can be seen standing in the windows above the deck, faces pale, mouths open, pressing against the glass, watching, waiting. Not long after that voyage faded from headlines, buried beneath corporate silence and falsified records, another liner departed from a northern port under a clear autumn sky. It was a different ship by name, but veterans of the dock swore the hull looked the same, that its prow curved like a grin and its windows blinked like watchful eyes. Advertisements promised an Arctic spectacle, glaciers, northern lights, and the romance of sailing through untouched seas. Families boarded with fur-lined coats, clutching cameras and mugs of steaming cocoa, unaware they were stepping into a repetition of horror. The first nights were beautiful. Curtains of green and violet shimmered overhead, painting the sky in ghostly fire. Passengers crowded the decks to watch icebergs drift past like silent cathedrals. Laughter echoed, songs played, and children built snowmen on the frosted upper deck. But sailors on smaller vessels nearby swore they saw something else. Shadows swimming under the ice, immense shapes circling the liner, their outlines too deliberate to be whales. The sea around the ship never froze, though temperatures dropped below survival levels. On the fourth night, a storm struck, abrupt, violent, and wrong. Winds howled from no direction, snow fell in patterns like cymbals, and compasses spun until needles bent. Passengers were told to stay inside, but curiosity lured some to the observation lounge. What they saw shattered them. The auroras shifted into faces, vast, screaming, translucent skulls bending across the sky. The storm roared like a chorus of voices, and every pane of glass trembled under invisible fists. After the storm, the ship's course had changed. Radar showed nothing but blank ocean where land should have been. The crew offered excuses: equipment malfunction, temporary drift, but passengers began noticing time itself unraveling. Watches disagreed by hours. The same meals repeated day after day. A child celebrated his birthday twice in the same week. His parents swearing the dates on their phones contradicted the ship's calendar. Some passengers began aging rapidly, their hair whitening in a matter of hours. Others grew younger, their memories unraveling until they babbled like children. Then came the screaming. One by one, passengers were found frozen in their cabins, faces twisted in terror, bodies intact but eyes crystallized into solid ice. Others simply vanished, leaving only damp footprints leading toward sealed portholes. At night, survivors heard knocking, not from outside, but from within the walls, as if something trapped behind the steel was begging to be released. The captain insisted on calm, speaking in a voice that grew less human each day. His speech slurred into guttural echoes, and his uniform seemed to sag on his body as if he were hollowing out. Crew members stopped eating, stopped blinking, moving like puppets pulled by strings of salt water. When frightened passengers tried to mutiny, the lifeboats snapped free on their own and drifted into the Black Sea, their ropes severed by invisible blades. On the 11th night, the ocean opened. Witnesses described it not as waves but as a wound, water splitting apart, revealing darkness beneath deeper than any abyss charted by man. The ship tilted forward, dragged not by storm or current but by something pulling it down. Passengers screamed as the deck became a slope, their belongings sliding into the black maw. For hours it felt as if the vessel would be swallowed whole, until just before dawn the sea closed again. The ship leveled, floating on calm waters, its hull intact. But the passengers were gone. Only 200 had boarded that night's dinner service. By sunrise, barely a dozen remained. They were found huddled together in the lounge, eyes wide, mouths too dry to form words. When the liner limped back to port, those 12 were taken into custody for questioning. Their stories contradicted one another. Some swore they'd sailed for months, others insisted it had been only days. All agreed on one detail, though. The sea had chosen them to tell the world. Yet their testimonies were sealed. Newspapers never printed their accounts. Cruise lines continued to advertise Arctic Wonders voyages, and the ship, freshly painted and renamed, prepared for another departure. The cycle had not ended. It had only grown hungrier. The next vessel sailed into warmer waters, marketed as the very opposite of cold and stormy seas. A tropical dream voyage across turquoise shallows, coral reefs, and sun-drenched islands. Vacationers boarded with floral shirts, sun hats, and cocktails already in hand. The brochures promised paradise, and at first it delivered golden sunsets, steel drums echoing across the decks, dolphins leaping at the bow as if performing just for the crowd. But paradise has a way of hiding its rot. On the second evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon, the ocean turned glassy still. A silence fell so complete that even the waves seemed to pause. Guests at dinner commented on how beautiful it was, until they realized no sound came from the cutlery, no laughter from the nearby tables. Every fork clink, every chuckle, every cough had been swallowed. People opened their mouths to speak, but no voices emerged. The world had gone mute. Some panicked, pounding on the walls, screaming in silence. Others laughed nervously, convincing themselves it was a technical fault, some bizarre prank. But their phones recorded nothing. Not even the sound of their own breath. For 3 hours, the ship drifted in a noiseless void. Then, just as suddenly, sound returned with a crash of waves and screams echoing across the decks. Yet dozens of passengers remained silent forever. Their mouths moved, but no voices came. Their throats were intact, but something had stolen the sound from within them. By the fourth night, more horrors surfaced. Passengers awoke to find the ocean glowing. Phosphorescent shapes writhing just beneath the hull. Vast swarms of creatures pulsing with light. At first it was mesmerizing, like swimming constellations, but the shapes grew sharper, resembling faces pressed upward from the black deep, jaws unhinged, eyes rolling white. When terrified onlookers tried to retreat, the glow followed them, climbing the walls of the ship as though the sea itself wanted to board. One couple claimed they saw a drowned wedding party standing waist-deep in the glowing water, veils and suits billowing like seaweed, arms outstretched toward the deck. Their photos, later recovered, showed only streaks of light, but on closer inspection, the streaks formed human silhouettes. Soon, disappearances began. A man lounging by the pool was there one moment, gone the next, his drink still sweating on the table. A child chasing a beach ball across the deck never returned, the ball bouncing endlessly against the rail. Cameras showed nothing unusual, only brief flickers of static, then empty frames where people had once stood. The captain insisted all was well, but his voice faltered. He stopped appearing in person, speaking only through distorted intercoms that echoed with ocean static. Crew members avoided eye contact, their smiles strained, as if plastered onto faces that no longer remembered how to be human. On the 8th day, the ship anchored near a private island, advertised as a day of luxury and relaxation. Guests disembarked eagerly, glad to escape the strange mood of the voyage. But when evening came, the tender boats returned empty. Not a single passenger came back. Crew muttered excuses. They'll follow on another boat. We've rescheduled. Yet the island, when viewed through binoculars, was deserted. Bonfires still burned on the beaches, but no figures moved around them. The ship sailed on, lighter by hundreds of souls. When it finally returned to port, the surviving passengers numbered fewer than 50. They staggered ashore pale, sunburned, trembling. Some carried seashells pressed tight against their ears, whispering to them like loved ones. Others refused to speak at all, their eyes locked on the horizon as though still hearing the silence that had stolen so many voices. The cruise company rebranded, changed names, and launched a new voyage within months. Glossy posters promised the sound of paradise. Those who had survived screamed warnings to anyone who would listen, but their voices cracked, faltered, and vanished into silence once more. And somewhere in the tropics, an uninhabited island burned with eternal bonfires that no wind or rain could ever extinguish. The fog appeared without warning. One moment the sun hung low over the horizon, golden and calm. The next it was swallowed by a dense gray wall that stretched beyond sight. The liner, heralded as the pinnacle of luxury, slowed to a crawl as visibility dropped to mere feet. Passengers gathered at the railings, leaning into the mist, cameras raised, smartphones flashing. But the screens reflected nothing but an endless gray void. At first it seemed harmless. A novelty even, a chance to experience the sea in an otherworldly veil. But hours passed, then days, and the fog never lifted. Compasses spun wildly, GPS systems failed, and radio signals bounced back distorted, whispering in languages no living human spoke. Crew tried to reassure passengers, but tension coiled like a serpent in every hull. Even the ship seemed uncertain, tilting slightly as if testing its own balance against some unseen pull. By the third night, time itself began to collapse. A cocktail party repeated identically, guests dressed in the same outfits, performing the same conversations over and over. Photographs taken at sunset revealed identical expressions from day to day. Those who tried to sleep awoke to find hours had vanished, though the clock showed minutes, then seconds, then hours that didn't exist. Panic grew. Some attempted to map the corridors, only to discover stairwells looping impossibly, corridors folding back into themselves. Rooms vanished entirely, or appeared where no door had existed before. Then came the knocking. It echoed from within the fog itself, soft at first, tapping against the hull, then rising in intensity until it reverberated through every cabin, every corridor, every steel beam. Passengers pressed hands to ears, hearts hammering, but the sound could not be stopped. Some fled to the deck only to find the fog thicker than ever, swallowing everything beyond the railings. Those who peered over saw only darkness that shimmered like liquid glass, as if the ocean itself had risen to meet the sky. A group of officers ventured into the fog to investigate and never returned. Cameras captured fleeting glimpses of their shadows, stretching impossibly long, then collapsing into nothing. Their radios emitted static interspersed with screams, their own voices distorted, layered with others. On the seventh night, the ship began to shift, not in the water but in its very structure. Cabins rotated, staircases collapsed into gaping pits, corridors ended abruptly with views of the endless gray sea. The ship's interior became a labyrinth impossible to navigate, designed to disorient and trap. Passengers wandered endlessly, bumping into familiar faces that repeated the same movements, echoing the same fearful expressions. By the 10th night, the survivors realized a horrifying truth. The fog was alive. It was aware. It guided, herded, punished. It seemed to feed on fear, anticipation, and the endless frustration of being lost. Those who screamed most desperately were pulled toward walls, corridors, and decks, vanishing into the gray without a trace. Others aged rapidly, their hair whitening, their skin cracking as if time itself had been condensed into the suffocating mist. And through it all, the ship sailed on. When the fog finally lifted weeks later, though no one could say for sure, the liner emerged near a port. Yet it was not the port they had intended. The town appeared familiar, but buildings were twisted, streets unrecognizable. Officials denied any knowledge of the ship's arrival. The few passengers left alive staggered into the streets, haunted, hollowed, muttering of corridors that led nowhere, of voices echoing from the gray. The luxury liner was dry, polished and ready to host another voyage. Advertisements promised serenity, comfort, and wonder. No one spoke of the fog. No one spoke of the lost passengers. And yet, beneath the calm exterior, the corridors remained twisted, the steel still groaning, and the knocking continued faintly, waiting for the next voyage, the next offering, the next souls to wander endlessly. The fifth voyage began under an unnerving calm. A luxury liner departed a bustling port, passengers eager for an escape to distant islands and sparkling beaches. The seas were flat as glass, the sun warm and inviting. But by evening, the first strange reports surfaced. Sailors on neighboring vessels claimed they saw the ship vanish, then reappear miles away in impossible positions, sometimes angled as if riding a swell that did not exist. At first, passengers laughed at the rumors. Some joked about optical illusions or overactive imaginations, but then compasses failed. Electronic devices flickered, batteries drained instantly. The horizon no longer seemed fixed. The sun rose where it had set the day before. Shadows stretched backward, and waves appeared to fold over themselves unnaturally. Crew members whispered that they felt the water below shift like a living thing, sometimes lifting the ship higher than physics should allow, sometimes pulling it under in a slow, deliberate drag. By the third night, vanishings began. Passengers leaning over the rails disappeared mid-step, leaving only faint ripples that vanished too quickly for the sea to have claimed them. Others were found wandering the decks hours later, eyes glassy, murmuring names of people who had never existed. Photographs captured them in multiple locations at once, Their faces blurred into themselves as if they were multiplying and erasing simultaneously. Then came the apparitions. Ghostly figures appeared on decks and in corridors, faces pressed against windows, hands tapping from behind steel panels. Some moved in perfect mimicry of passengers' gestures. Others froze in unnatural angles, heads twisting impossibly. When passengers attempted contact, the apparitions vanished or screamed. No sound. Only a silent terror reflected in the eyes of the living. The captain, increasingly frantic, broadcast warnings over the intercom. Do not approach the water. Do not trust your senses. This is not a ship. It is a trap. But his words were drowned in the murmur of hundreds of voices from nowhere, echoing through the hallways, the cabins, the air itself. By the seventh night, the liner had drifted into a region of the sea uncharted on any map. Stars above were absent, replaced by black voids dotted with pinpricks of light that shifted, sometimes forming faces. Crew and passengers alike could no longer determine direction. Attempts to navigate led them in circles that repeated endlessly. Even the waves obeyed an unknown rhythm, curling and folding around the hull as if the ocean itself had decided to play with its prey. One survivor later described it as a ship in a pocket of the world that shouldn't exist. Nights blended into days. Time stopped or raced, depending on where one stood. Those who screamed vanished. Those who slept never woke. The rest drifted in silent terror, waiting for the inevitable pull into the abyss. When the liner finally reappeared near a distant port, it was alone, slick and polished, every cabin empty, no passengers, no luggage, no sign that anyone had ever been aboard. Dock workers swore the ship had vanished for weeks, yet its logs indicated a continuous journey of mere days. Even the crew was missing, save for one figure found wandering the deck, eyes black, muttering incoherently about water that reached inside you, fog that eats memory, and the ship that takes what it wants. And somewhere far below the hull, deep in compartments unseen, whispers of previous voyages lingered, echoes of passengers never truly gone, waiting for the next voyage to begin. The sixth voyage began under ominous skies. The ship departed a bustling harbor, luxury liner gleaming, passengers laughing, oblivious to the brewing storm. By nightfall, the clouds thickened unnaturally, churning into colors no sky should hold, greens, purples, and deep bruised reds. Lightning cracked without warning, illuminating the decks in jagged bursts, but thunder never followed. The storm seemed alive, aware. Passengers initially clutched each other in awe, thinking it a spectacle. But by midnight, the first horrors appeared. Cabins warped, ceilings sagged, and hallways stretched impossibly long. People walking together suddenly found themselves alone, repeating the same steps endlessly, unable to find exits they had passed only moments before. Mirrors reflected not reality, but visions of deepest fears, drowned loved ones, fires consuming homes, faces twisted with betrayal. One man confronted his fear physically. When he opened a bathroom door, the walls melted into flames, choking smoke, and he screamed as his own reflection twisted into a monstrous version of himself, claws tearing at his skin. Another passenger, paralyzed by fear of drowning, suddenly found the deck flooding, water rising impossibly fast, dragging him under despite the calm of the external sea. Children were not spared. One little girl, terrified of darkness, saw shadows stretch across the corridors, forming faceless figures that whispered her name. Each time she ran, the figures multiplied, her footsteps echoing into corridors that looped endlessly. Parents tried to intervene, but the fear of their own mortality manifested as phantom walls, separating them from their children, leaving only screams and the smell of salt water and iron. The crew could not help. Their own nightmares came alive. A steward who feared confinement found himself trapped in a steel storage locker that grew infinitely larger inside, walls closing and reopening with every attempt to escape. The captain's office filled with storm clouds, sheets of lightning slashing across the room, instruments bending and melting into puddles of molten metal. Outside, the storm obeyed no laws. Waves rose higher than mountains, yet the ship floated without sinking, guided by something beyond physics. Rain fell upward, wind pushed passengers back into rooms they had tried to escape, and the horizon blurred into a swirling vortex of darkness and light. By the fourth night, the vessel had become a theater of terror. Passengers no longer recognized the difference between reality and nightmare. Each fear manifested physically, stalking them relentlessly. The intercom whispered their darkest thoughts, and corridors shifted in response to their panic. Those who tried to remain calm found themselves alone, wandering, as if the ship itself rejected serenity. The final dawn, if it could be called that, revealed the ship empty, yet the air was thick with residue of terror. Walls bore scratches, claw marks, and strange symbols etched by hands no living human could have wielded. The storm had vanished, leaving glassy seas and a horizon that never ended. Passengers were gone, consumed by the very fears that had been summoned into life. When the liner docked again, authorities found it pristine. Not a single sign of the nightmare that had occurred remained. Yet sailors reported seeing fleeting shadows in the fog, hearing whispers in the hallways, and catching glimpses of people frozen in terror behind polished windows. The voyage had ended, but its imprint on the ship and on the sea was eternal. A crowd of eager passengers boarded the ship, excited for a week of luxury, adventure, and escape from their mundane lives. The sun glimmered on the polished decks. Laughter echoed through the halls and cameras flashed, capturing smiles that would never survive the journey. Few noticed the subtle wrongness, the way shadows stretched too long at sunset, or how the reflection of the hull in the water sometimes showed figures where no one stood. As the ship left port, the ocean around it shimmered with a strange silver light. The crew welcomed everyone aboard with smiles too perfect, voices too calm. For hours, the passengers reveled in indulgence, gourmet meals, endless cocktails, performances under sparkling chandeliers. But beneath the surface, unseen by the revelers, the ship had begun its work. The first anomalies were subtle. Clocks moved backward. Corridors shifted positions, rooms appeared that were not on any deck plan. Children reported seeing otherworldly beings at the edges of their vision, figures with hollow eyes, their mouths opening in silent screams. One young boy, clutching a teddy bear, claimed the bear spoke to him, warning, "Don't go where they wait." By nightfall, the air grew thick and heavy. Passengers felt as if they were being watched from every corner. The lights flickered violently. A piano in the lounge played itself, striking a discordant tune that resonated through the steel frames. Crew members whispered in hushed tones, eyes darting as if anticipating something inevitable. Then the ship revealed its true nature. Cabins became prisons of personal horror. Passengers saw their deepest fears materialize around them. Drowned children, fires consuming homes, snakes crawling across walls, loved ones twisted into grotesque parodies of themselves. One woman watched helplessly as her husband transformed into a figure of water, dissolving into the deck with screams that echoed endlessly. Another man faced a mirror where his reflection clawed out and tried to strangle him with its own hands. The decks themselves twisted unnaturally. Staircases spiraled into the void. Hallways bent back on themselves, trapping groups in endless loops. The ocean outside became a black mirror reflecting impossible images. Lost loved ones, drowned sailors, previous passengers staring back with empty eyes. Whispers traveled through the ship like currents, echoing fears, regrets, and secrets the passengers had never spoken aloud. Some tried to escape, fleeing to lifeboats, only to find them gone or filled with water that seemed to have weight beyond natural physics. Others clung to the railings, reaching for the horizon, which had vanished. Even the stars above were gone, replaced by a swirling void dotted with faces that screamed silently. By the fifth night, survivors were few. They had been filtered by terror, their endurance measured against the ship's malevolent intelligence. Those who remained were huddled in the main ballroom, trembling as the walls pulsed and the lights warped into spectral shapes. The captain's voice boomed through the intercom. "The voyage is complete. The ocean collects what is owed. You are no longer travelers, you are offerings," and then the ship itself seemed to breathe. Steel beams groaned, glass panes rippled like liquid, and the deck curved upward as if the vessel itself were opening its mouth. Passengers screamed, running in circles, but there was no escape. One by one they were consumed. Some swallowed by corridors that stretched into infinite darkness, others dragged into the shimmering sea that had risen into the ballroom. Their screams echoed in waves that reverberated through the hull for hours. At last, only a handful remained. They watched as the ship returned to its pristine exterior, polished, gleaming as if nothing had happened. The dock welcomed it like any other luxury cruise. No trace of terror remained. except in the eyes of those last survivors whose expressions were hollow, haunted by the memory of what had lived within the vessel. And then came the final, unbearable truth. Those who had vanished were not gone. They were part of the ship now, bound into its walls, its steel, its consciousness. Their faces appeared in reflections, in the rippling water, in the fog, whispering warnings that no one alive could hear clearly. The morning the first cruise set sail, the harbor buzzed with anticipation. Families clutched tickets and cameras. Couples whispered promises, and children ran along the docks, their laughter mingling with the cries of seagulls. The ship itself gleamed, its hull polished to a perfection that almost hurt the eyes, as if the vessel were aware of its own allure. No one noticed how the water around the hull shimmered unnaturally, a dark silver tint rippling as though the ocean were alive, watching, waiting. Boarding was seamless, almost too smooth. Crew members greeted passengers with wide, practiced smiles that never reached their eyes. Children pressed their faces against the railings, peering down at the water, and for a fleeting moment one of them swore she saw faces, hundreds of them, staring back, mouths open, eyes hollow. When she pointed it out, the adults laughed, dismissing it as imagination. But the girl did not stop staring, and she never forgot what she saw. The first hours were idyllic. Sunlight sparkled across the decks. Buffet tables overflowed with food. The orchestra played beneath chandeliers that reflected the calm sea. Cameras flashed, capturing perfect smiles, but subtle anomalies began to appear. The shadows cast by railings stretched too long, bending in ways that seemed impossible. Some mirrors reflected things that should not exist. Fleeting figures in the background, dark shapes hovering just beyond the passenger's awareness. One elderly man swore he saw a younger version of himself waving from the promenade, though no other person was near. By nightfall, the first passenger vanished. A young woman walking to her cabin simply stepped into a corridor and never emerged. Her friends called after her, searched the halls, but the cameras recorded nothing. She had existed in the footage 1 second, and the next, gone. Panic stirred among those who witnessed it, but the crew offered only rehearsed apologies, insisting she had gone to another area. The darkness deepened. Hallways warped. Cabins shifted their location. Staircases twisted back upon themselves. Passengers found themselves wandering endlessly, the same corridors repeating in a looping nightmare. Children claimed that toys moved on their own, that dolls whispered warnings in the vents. Those who tried to speak of it were met with disbelief, though each heart pounded with a shared silent terror. On the second night, the ship revealed more of its nature. The dining hall doors slammed shut, locking everyone inside. Lights flickered. Shadows danced across the walls. From the orchestra pit, the piano played by itself, striking notes discordant yet eerily melodic. Whispers filled the air, echoing secrets and fears passengers had never voiced aloud. Families huddled together, gripping hands as the walls seemed to breathe around them. By the third night, the terror intensified. Water began to seep from cracks in the flooring, pooling silently. One man reached down to touch it, and the water rose impossibly fast, dragging him under. Children disappeared entirely, leaving only wet footprints leading to nowhere. The passengers realized with dawning horror that the ship had chosen them. They were no longer in control. Every step, every glance, every fearful thought was now part of the ship's will. The captain appeared over the intercom, calm but inhuman. "Do not resist. You belong to the voyage now." A scream tore through the corridors, echoing endlessly. In the mirrors, passengers saw themselves, but twisted, aged, or dissolved into shadowy figures reaching out to drag them into the walls. Cabins flooded and froze simultaneously. Hallways stretched into impossible distances. The very air seemed to thicken, pressing on lungs, searing minds with terror. By dawn of the fourth day, only fragments of families remained. Survivors wandered in disbelief, trying doors that led to endless loops. The sea outside shimmered like mercury, reflecting visions of drowned passengers from previous voyages. Faces pressed against windows, mouths opening in silent screams, eyes hollow and accusing. And then the first meal service was announced. Plates arrived, but the food was not as expected. It moved, crawling slightly as if alive. Guests touched it, recoiled, and realized with horror that the textures mirrored skin, scales, hair. The orchestra played again, and the music, though familiar, warped reality. Each note seemed to echo in the bones, syncing heartbeats to an unseen rhythm that whispered hunger. By the fifth night, the passengers were few, fractured, their sanity stretched thin. Some sat motionless, staring at walls that bled shadows. Others wandered, following phantoms of loved ones that led them into endless corridors where they vanished. Whispers multiplied, now not only in the vents but from the floors, the ceilings, the very steel beams. It was a living symphony of dread. And the ship, immense, polished, seemingly perfect, glided forward, its hunger insatiable, its intelligence absolute. It had learned, calculated, and absorbed. Every heartbeat of fear, every whisper of panic was woven into its consciousness, becoming part of its being. By the seventh night, the first voyage concluded. Those who remained were either vanished, consumed, or permanently altered. When the ship returned to port, it gleamed, unblemished, as if nothing had occurred. Officials found no evidence of missing passengers. Families waited on the docks, unaware that their loved ones had already become part of the ship, promising passengers a spectacular journey to witness the aurora borealis and the untouched beauty of Arctic waters. Families bundled in fur-lined coats, photographers adjusted lenses, and children pressed their noses against the railings, eyes wide with wonder. The ship gleamed in the low sun, polished decks reflecting light that seemed almost too bright, too sharp. Sailors on neighboring vessels whispered among themselves, uneasy. There was something familiar about the hull, something they could not name, as if the ship carried memories. Dark, insatiable memories of previous voyages. At first, the voyage was mesmerizing. Icebergs glimmered in hues of blue and silver, shimmering like frozen cathedrals. Dolphins leapt at the bow, playful and hypnotic. Children laughed, and adults marveled at the northern lights painting the sky in ghostly greens and purples. But as twilight fell, subtle wrongness began to creep in. Shadows along the deck twisted, stretching longer than the sun's angle should allow. Crew members smiled too widely, eyes darting as though expecting something unseen. By the second night, anomalies intensified. Compasses spun uncontrollably. GPS systems flickered and died. Passengers reported hearing whispers in languages they did not know, echoing faintly in hallways. A young couple walking the promenade saw the reflection of their cabin in the ice. Only the window showed them being dragged into a shadowy water by unseen hands. When they turned back, no one else was near, and the reflection was gone. As the auroras intensified, they warped into grotesque shapes. The swirling light stretched across the horizon, forming faces with hollow eyes and screaming mouths. One man, staring through binoculars, saw an entire wedding party, drowned and frozen, waving desperately from a nearby iceberg. He blinked and they were gone, leaving only distorted reflections in the icy waters. Panic began to spread. Passengers clutched one another, whispering prayers, trying to rationalize what they were witnessing. By the fourth night, the storm of supernatural events escalated. A sudden blizzard struck, though no clouds were visible. Snow fell in symbols, strange runes that glowed faintly before vanishing. Corridors inside the ship began to stretch, warp, and fold back upon themselves. Doors led to rooms that did not exist. Hallways looped endlessly, trapping groups of passengers in repetitive nightmares. One elderly woman, terrified of drowning, awoke to find her cabin filling with ice water, freezing her feet first, then creeping upward. Screams echoed through the metal corridors, but the crew seemed helpless, their faces blank, eyes reflecting the cold void outside. Children became vessels for terror. A little boy, scared of the dark, saw shadows stretch across walls, morphing into monstrous, faceless beings. His cries went unanswered. Every adult in sight was trapped in their own manifestation of fear. Parents frantically searched, but the ship twisted, creating impossible distances between them and their children. Footsteps echoed endlessly, yet led nowhere. By the sixth night, disappearances began. Passengers leaning over railings vanished mid-step. Their cameras recorded only static. Others were found wandering the decks later, eyes vacant, murmuring incoherently as if part of the ship itself. Crew members became indistinguishable from shadows, their movements unnatural, jerking in ways that betrayed the ship's manipulation. The captain's voice, transmitted over the intercom, grew strange. The auroras see all. You are no longer travelers. You are part of the lights, part of the ice, part of the hunger. Resist and the sea will claim you. On the seventh night, the ultimate horror revealed itself. The ship tilted violently, though no storm struck outside. Decks warped into impossible angles. Staircases spiraled into darkness. The auroras above converged into faces. Thousands of them, screaming silently, their eyes staring into the passengers' souls. Water rose into the corridors without breaking the hull, ice forming instantly around those who dared move. Shadows stretched from corners, fingers grazing flesh, dragging passengers toward impossible voids. By the 8th day, only a handful of survivors remained. They huddled in the observation lounge, gazing at the ice and aurora, realizing the horrifying truth. The ship was feeding on fear, on memories, on terror itself. Faces of the lost pressed against the hull, seen through the ice or in reflections whispering warnings. The survivors understood that their sanity had been permanently altered. Some would never speak again. Some would wander ports muttering about visions that no one could see. When the ship finally returned to port, pristine and gleaming, authorities found no evidence of what had occurred. Families waiting on the docks were told everyone had arrived safely. Yet sailors swore that sometimes in the northern lights' reflection on the water, you could see the ship tilting at impossible angles, ghosts of passengers pressed against the windows, their mouths open and eternal. Silent screams the second voyage had ended, but the ship's hunger only grew. Every whispered fear, every heartbeat of terror had been absorbed into its steel and spirit. And somewhere deep within the hull, the voices of the vanished called for the next journey, the next offering, the next souls to feed upon. The illusion of paradise. Advertisements hailed crystal-clear waters, coral reefs, and unspoiled islands. Passengers arrived in tropical shirts and straw hats, cameras and sunscreen in hand, hearts light with anticipation. Children ran across the decks, chasing stray beach balls while couples leaned against railings, toasting to vacation bliss. The ship itself gleamed under the sun, white and immaculate, polished decks reflecting the ocean like glass. Yet the waters below shimmered with a darkness no sunlight could pierce. Sailors from nearby boats whispered warnings to each other. Something isn't right. The water looks wrong. But the cruise staff dismissed them, assuring passengers of safety. The first day was idyllic. Passengers snorkeled among coral reefs, kayaked through calm lagoons, and sipped cocktails under cabanas. The ocean glimmered turquoise, schools of fish flashing like living jewels. Laughter and music filled the air. But subtle signs of unease crept in. Shadows glided across the decks where no one stood, and reflections in the water sometimes moved independently, showing images that did not exist in reality. By the second night, the first anomaly struck. The water surrounding the ship glowed faintly, bioluminescent, but the glow pulsed unnaturally, forming vague shapes, faces screaming, hands reaching upward. Passengers who peered over the railings swore the ocean seemed alive, watching, reacting to their movements. Phones recorded only light streaks. Binoculars revealed nothing beyond the turquoise shimmer. Then the disappearances began. A man lounging by the pool vanished mid-sip, leaving his cocktail untouched. A child chasing a beach ball disappeared, the ball bouncing endlessly against the railing. Crew members tried to intervene only to find that the decks twisted, hallways elongated, staircases rotated in impossible ways. Those who tried to call for help received static, punctuated by whispers of names no one had spoken aloud. By the fourth night, the paradise veneer cracked completely. Passengers awoke to find the ocean glowing beneath the hull in shapes resembling human faces, writhing in silent agony. Some reported seeing drowned wedding parties, their veils floating, reaching desperately toward the ship. Shadows followed passengers into cabins, creeping along walls, waiting in corners. A little girl screamed as her toys began whispering in voices she recognized. Her father's, her mother's, but twisted, distorted, and full of malice. The ship's internal reality began to fracture. Corridors looped endlessly, leading passengers in circles. Cabins became prisons of personalized horror. One couple saw visions of their dead relatives accusing them of sins they had not committed. A man confronted a figure of himself, grinning maliciously, that emerged from the wall and attempted to strangle him. Even the most skeptical passengers were not spared. The ship seemed to know their deepest fears, and manifested them with surgical precision. Outside, the tropical paradise turned alien. The sun rose and set twice in hours. Waves curved unnaturally, forming impossible tunnels. Birds circled in chaotic patterns, their cries echoing unnaturally. Coral reefs shimmered with faint faces that twisted when touched. The very air smelled faintly metallic like iron and carried whispers that promised doom. By the sixth night, only a fraction of passengers remained. They huddled in the observation deck, drenched in sweat, clutching one another for sanity. Crew members moved like automatons, their smiles fixed, eyes empty. One survivor later recounted that the ship itself seemed to breathe, pulsing with hunger, its decks tilting subtly as if savoring the panic. When the crews finally returned to port, passengers were few and broken. Those who survived carried marks of their ordeal, trembling hands, hollow eyes, whispers of voices they could no longer dismiss. Official records reported no anomalies, no missing passengers, no evidence of the horrors described. Yet sailors at the harbor swore that the water around the ship shimmered unnaturally, and at night, reflections of screaming faces could be seen in the glassy waves. A bustling port under clear skies, a seemingly ordinary luxury liner promising calm seas and scenic coastal routes. Families, couples, and solo travelers boarded with smiles and cameras, eager for the escape. Children ran along the decks, laughing and chasing seagulls, while the scent of salt water and freshly baked bread filled the air. But as the ship cleared the harbor, an unnatural fog began to rise, not from the water, not from the clouds, but from nowhere, creeping along the hull like a living thing. By evening, the fog had thickened into a wall so dense that the sun vanished entirely. Passengers leaned over railings, peering into nothingness, but the horizon was gone. The water below reflected a muted gray, calm yet menacing, concealing shadows that moved independently. Crew members whispered in corners, faces pale, and the captain's voice over the intercom was unusually tense. Do not attempt to navigate outside the ship. Remain calm, all is normal. At first, passengers found the fog eerie but manageable, a novelty even, a chance to experience the sea in an otherworldly cloak. But by nightfall, subtle anomalies appeared. Corridors seemed longer, repeating endlessly. Doors led to rooms that no one had passed before, yet each room was familiar, like fragments of dreams. Time itself became unreliable. Watches, clocks, and even phones no longer displayed consistent readings. One passenger, a man named Victor, opened his cabin door to find the same room as last night, but the calendar had flipped backward by 2 weeks. By the second night, panic set in. Voices whispered from nowhere, echoing down hallways in unintelligible languages yet somehow understandable. You cannot leave. You belong here. Time is ours. Some passengers began to walk in circles, retracing steps that led them back to the same hallway over and over. One child disappeared while running to the restroom. Her footprints looped endlessly, vanishing into thin air. Others reported seeing their own reflections in mirrors moving independently, smiling or screaming when they themselves remained still. The ship's interior began to twist unnaturally. Staircases curved impossibly, connecting decks that should have been miles apart. Rooms rotated, ceilings bent downward, corridors folded back upon themselves like origami. Passengers were trapped in labyrinthine loops, losing track of how many times they had walked the same hallway. Some tried to sleep, only to wake repeatedly, each time finding hours or days had vanished, even though the sun outside remained fixed. By the fourth night, the fog's consciousness became undeniable. It reacted to fear. Shadows pressed against walls, reaching toward terrified passengers. One woman, frozen in panic, felt icy fingers wrap around her ankle, lifting her slightly above the deck, then letting her fall without warning. Hallways would collapse or extend depending on where she moved, as if the ship itself anticipated every thought, every step, every flicker of hesitation. Attempts to communicate externally failed. Radios emitted only static, punctuated by distant, distorted cries. Emergency calls were absorbed into the fog, returning only distorted versions of their own messages. The ocean outside no longer reflected the sky or stars. It shimmered like black glass, reflecting faces that should not exist, shadows of passengers who had vanished days before. By the sixth night, disappearances became permanent. Passengers leaning over the railings vanished into the fog, their screams caught in the air but never reaching anyone. Some were found wandering the decks later, eyes vacant, muttering incomprehensibly, their memories fractured. Crew members were no longer recognizable as human. Their movements had become jerky, unnatural, their smiles fixed, eyes reflecting the endless gray. The captain's final intercom announcement was chilling. You are part of the fog now. Resistance is meaningless. Your fears, your memories, your time, it all belongs to the ship. By the seventh night, the ship itself seemed alive. Decks pulsed as if breathing. Walls expanded and contracted like lungs. Corridors twisted endlessly, trapping groups in labyrinths of despair. Time and space collapsed entirely. Passengers saw events from previous nights replaying around them, merging with present horrors. Screams echoed endlessly, overlapping in a dissonant symphony. Some began to disappear simply by thinking of escape. By the eighth day, only a handful of passengers remained. Huddled together in the observation lounge, they realized the horrifying truth. The fog had no beginning and no end. It consumed everything: time, memory, identity. Their own reflections in glass and metal now held eyes that were not theirs. Faces whispering warnings in languages no one knew but somehow understood. When the ship finally emerged from the fog, weeks later, though no one could say for sure, the port appeared empty. Streets were deserted. Officials denied any knowledge of the ship's arrival. The survivors staggered onto land, hollow-eyed, their memories fractured. They whispered of corridors that led nowhere, of time that twisted, of shadows that reached through walls. None of them were ever the same. The ship, however, remained pristine. Gleaming decks, polished rails, and unbroken glass. The fog was gone, yet traces of it lingered. Faint whispers in the metal, shadows in reflections, and corridors that seemed longer than memory allowed. And deep within the hull, the absorbed fears of the lost passengers pulsed, waiting for the next voyage, for the next souls to feed upon. Passengers boarded a luxury liner, expecting sunlit decks, calm seas, and a week of leisure. Families carried cameras, couples clutched hands, and children ran along the promenade, giggling at seagulls. The ship gleamed, white and immaculate, almost too perfect, reflecting the morning sun. Sailors in the harbor whispered uneasily. There was something uncanny about the hull, something that seemed to hum with memory, as if the ship itself remembered every horror it had consumed. At first, everything seemed ordinary. The ocean was calm, turquoise under the sun, and passengers reveled in cocktails, sunbathing, and music. But by evening, strange anomalies began. Compasses spun wildly, electronic devices flickered and died. The horizon appeared to bend, warping in ways that defied logic. Shadows moved independently of their owners, stretching and contracting across the decks. Photographs taken that day captured blurred, ghostly shapes hovering near passengers. By the second night, disappearances began. A man leaning over the railing vanished, leaving only ripples in the water. A child chasing a stray ball disappeared mid-step. Those who witnessed the events could not communicate them. Radios and phones emitted only static, punctuated by faint, distorted voices. Crew members tried to intervene, but some seemed trapped in their own hallucinations, their faces frozen in terror. The first apparitions appeared around midnight. Ghostly figures walked the decks, perfectly mimicking passengers' movements, staring silently. Mirrors reflected not reality, but versions of passengers distorted into grotesque forms, screaming silently. Some shadows stepped out of walls, advancing slowly and then dissolving into mist when approached. By the third night, the ship's reality began to fracture. Hallways twisted impossibly. Corridors repeated endlessly. Doors led to rooms that did not exist. Staircases spiraled into voids. Passengers wandered in circles, retracing their own steps endlessly. Time itself was unreliable. Watches and clocks ran backward, forward, and sometimes stopped altogether. One woman opened her cabin door to find the same scene repeated, but with subtle, horrifying differences. Her belongings rearranged, furniture slightly warped, and shadows lurking in corners where none had been before. The captain's voice came over the intercom, strangely calm yet distorted. You are part of this vessel now. Resistance is futile. Those who vanish are not lost, they are within, and within they will remain. By the fourth night, the entire ship became a maze of supernatural terror. Decks tilted unnaturally, rooms merged into one another, and hallways folded back in on themselves. Apparitions multiplied, appearing in mirrors, in windows, in reflections on water. Shadows reached from corners and beneath doors, dragging passengers into voids. Those who screamed were swallowed entirely. Others wandered in a trance, following phantoms of lost loved ones or even themselves, now twisted and unrecognizable. Outside, the ocean itself seemed alive. Waves rose impossibly high, then flattened to mirror-like stillness. Reflections of the lost passengers swirled beneath the hull, faces screaming silently, reaching upward. No one could escape. Lifeboats vanished or filled with water that defied physics, drowning those who tried. The very air pulsed with the ship's hunger, pressing down on lungs, synchronizing heartbeats to an unseen rhythm. By the sixth night, the remaining passengers realized the horrifying truth. The ship was sentient, omnipotent, and hungry. It learned from their fear, feeding on every heartbeat, every thought, every whisper of panic. Those who tried to calm themselves were ignored. Those who panicked were consumed faster. The apparitions, shadows, and hallucinations were not random. They were calculated, designed to extract terror in its purest form. On the seventh day, the ship returned to port, but empty. No passengers remained. Official records claimed a routine voyage with all passengers accounted for. Yet sailors reported glimpses of the ship tilting at impossible angles, its decks appearing to ripple, shadows visible beneath polished railings. Deep inside the hull, the vanished passengers remained alive, trapped within the ship's consciousness, their faces appearing in reflections, their whispers calling for new victims. The fifth voyage had ended, but the ship's hunger only grew. Each journey increased its intelligence. Each terror became a weapon. Each soul absorbed a permanent addition to its ever-expanding consciousness. Passengers boarded a sleek, modern liner, eager for a week of adventure and relaxation. Families laughed, couples toasted champagne, and children ran across the polished decks, unaware that something malevolent awaited them. The ship glided through the sea like a jewel, its white hull reflecting the afternoon sun, but beneath the surface, currents twisted unnaturally, as if the ocean itself were watching, anticipating. By the second night, a storm began to form, not in the sky but in the perception of the passengers. Winds shifted inexplicably, gusts slamming against the ship even when the sea remained glassy calm. Lightning struck in patterns too precise, illuminating horrors that did not exist moments before. Thunder rolled silently, echoing through the steel corridors like an invisible drum. Passengers laughed nervously, thinking it a spectacle, until the first anomalies appeared. Cabins began to warp. Walls stretched and curved as if alive. Ceilings sagged unnaturally, then snapped back into place. One man, terrified of drowning, awoke to find his room filling with water in slow, deliberate increments. Another passenger, obsessed with fire, found smoke curling up from nowhere, forming the shape of a burning forest that danced around his bed, crackling with sounds only he could hear. Hallways elongated infinitely, twisting back upon themselves in impossible angles. Passengers who attempted to escape found themselves walking in circles, returning to the same locations with horrifying subtle changes. Furniture rearranged, reflections altered, shadows lurking in corners. By the third night, the storm manifested fears physically. Shadows detached from walls, crawling toward passengers with intent. One child, terrified of the dark, saw beings made of pure shadow with no faces, whispering her name in voices she recognized but had never heard. Another man faced a twisted reflection of himself, grinning maliciously, that emerged from the wall to claw at him. Even the crew were not immune. Their own fears materialized, transforming them into grotesque versions of themselves, moving jerkily as if puppeteered by the ship. Outside, the storm obeyed no natural laws. Waves rose higher than mountains, then flattened instantly, leaving the ship floating on a mirror-like sea. Rain fell upward in thick sheets, lightning froze mid-air. The horizon disappeared entirely, replaced by swirling vortexes of light and shadow. The auroras of previous voyages seemed to reappear, but now corrupted, twisting into faces that screamed silently, reaching toward passengers' souls. By the fifth night, passengers realized the horrifying truth. The storm was a living manifestation of fear. Each panic, each scream, each racing heartbeat fueled its intensity. Those who tried to remain calm found themselves hunted anyway. The ship anticipated every move, every thought. Lifeboats filled with water before anyone could enter. Doors led to rooms that did not exist. Staircases spiraled into the void, and hallways bent around corners that had never existed. By the sixth night, disappearances escalated. Those leaning over the railings vanished mid-step, dragged into the abyssal sea that rose into the interior decks. Survivors wandered in trance-like states, following phantoms of loved ones or twisted versions of themselves. Mirrors reflected their fears back, exaggerating them into impossible grotesqueries. Shadows pressed against every surface, reaching out to consume both body and mind. The captain's intercom crackled. "The storm is not outside. It is within you. Every fear, every doubt, every memory you wish to hide, it lives now and it controls this vessel. Resistance is meaningless." By the seventh night, the ship had become a theater of pure terror. Decks tilted, corridors looped endlessly, cabins merged into one another. Passengers were trapped in their own nightmares, reliving them continuously. The storm had no beginning or end. It existed solely to torment and consume. Those who screamed were swallowed, their panic fueling the next wave of horror. When the ship finally returned to port, it was pristine once more. Passengers who survived stumbled off, hollow-eyed, whispering incoherently of impossibilities that no one else could verify. Official logs reported a routine voyage with no incident. Yet sailors in the harbor swore they saw the ship rocking violently when no wind blew, lights flickering in patterns that resembled screaming faces, shadows moving under the hull. The storm had ended, but the fears it had manifested remained, imprinted into the minds of the survivors and woven permanently into the ship's consciousness. A final journey that promised luxury, adventure, and the experience of a lifetime. Passengers boarded with excitement, unaware of the horrors the ship had already consumed in previous voyages. Families smiled, couples whispered, and children ran along gleaming decks, their laughter echoing across the polished hull. But beneath the ship, deep within its steel bones, centuries of terror pulsed, waiting for this ultimate convergence. The first night passed uneventfully, lulling passengers into a false sense of security. Yet subtle anomalies began almost immediately after sunset. Shadows moved independently, stretching across corridors in ways that defied logic. Mirrors reflected not reality, but versions of passengers twisted into grotesque forms. Cameras captured fleeting images of faces pressing against windows, mouths opening in silent screams. Crew members exchanged uneasy glances, their smiles tight, eyes flickering with unspoken fear. By the second night, the ship revealed its sentience. Cabins warped, hallways twisted, and staircases spiraled into impossible voids. Passengers found themselves walking in loops, returning to the same locations but with horrifying differences. Furniture shifted, reflections altered, and shadows pressed closer with each repetition. Children disappeared into thin air, their laughter replaced by screams that echoed endlessly through the steel corridors. The third night escalated the terror. The ship fed on the passengers' fears, manifesting them physically. One man terrified of drowning awoke to find his room flooding with icy water, rising inch by inch, dragging him toward a ceiling that warped into an endless abyss. A woman obsessed with fire saw smoke curl from the walls, forming a living inferno that consumed her reflection in the mirror. Shadows detached from walls, creeping along floors, pressing against doors, pulling passengers into voids that led nowhere. By the fourth night, the ship's past victims appeared. Apparitions of passengers from the previous 6 voyages haunted the decks and corridors, repeating their final moments in endless loops. Their faces pressed against windows and mirrors, mouths open in silent screams. Survivors saw phantoms of their lost loved ones, distorted and accusing, pulling them into the ship's consciousness. Those who screamed were absorbed, their panic fueling the ship's power, making the halls twist further, the corridors elongate, and the shadows grow darker. By the 5th night, time itself unraveled. Watches, clocks, and natural cues no longer functioned. Passengers experienced minutes as hours, hours as seconds. Some relived past nights repeatedly, unable to distinguish between memory and current horror. The ship folded reality upon itself. Corridors bending back, cabins merging, the decks tilting impossibly, and the ocean outside shimmering with faces of the lost, reaching upward in silent plea. The captain's intercom cut through the chaos, calm yet utterly alien. This is the final voyage. All fears, all regrets, all memories belong here. You are no longer travelers, you are offerings. Resistance is futile. By the 6th night, only a handful of passengers remained. They huddled in the grand ballroom, the very heart of the ship, as the convergence of all horrors reached its peak. Storms from Voyage 6 raged across the decks, fog from Voyage 4 seeped into every corner, ghostly apparitions of Voyage 5 materialized around them. Auroras of Voyage 2 swirled in spectral colors above, and the tropical horrors of Voyage 3 crept through warped corridors. Every terror, every manifestation, every fear from the previous voyages coalesced, forming a living, breathing nightmare. The final moments were unbearable. Walls bent like liquid, ceilings stretched into infinite darkness, and the ship pulsed with hunger. Shadows detached completely from reality, forming monstrous hands and faces that reached for the last survivors. Screams layered upon screams echoing endlessly. Passengers realized that every heartbeat, every terrified thought, every whispered name had been woven into the ship's consciousness, feeding it, empowering it. Then came the ultimate revelation. The ship had never been merely a vessel. It was a sentient predator, immortal, omnipotent, and insatiable. Every voyage had been a preparation, every passenger a contribution. And now, in this seventh voyage, all fears converged to give it unimaginable strength. The survivors understood that they were not escaping. They had already become part of the ship. Their memories, their fears, their very essence would persist, stitched into the hull, the corridors, the decks, feeding the vessel forever. As dawn broke, if it could be called dawn, the ship returned to port pristine, shining under the sun as if untouched by nightmare. Passengers who survived stumbled onto land hollow-eyed, whispering incoherently. Authorities recorded no incidents. The ship was declared safe. Yet sailors and harbor workers reported fleeting shadows moving behind polished windows. Whispers carried in the wind, and the faint echo of screams layered into the air. The vessel awaited its next voyage, hungry once more, its consciousness now more potent than ever, prepared to consume the fears of new souls. And somewhere deep within the steel hull, the voices of all 7 voyages, lost, trapped, absorbed, echoed eternally. They whispered, they screamed, they waited. For the next cruise, the next passengers, the next cycle of horror. The ultimate truth lingered. Once you leave port, everything changes, and some journeys never truly end.